Some of the things I think are holding Puerto Rico back, and perhaps where the federal government can play a role in helping the recovery. And I think this touches a little bit of on what Ann was talking about, where we'd like to see Puerto Rico become the Singapore of the Caribbean. I know that the Speaker of the House was here at ABI last week, and he used precisely the same phrase. I've had phone calls with congressional staff, and they say, "How come we don't have the Singapore of the Caribbean yet?" I'm like, "Well, we're working on it." But that it's some very significant policy issues that I think are not to be so easily overcome. The devastation on the island and on the 3 million American citizens there has refocused public attention on Puerto Rico. We obviously have a lot of federal aid now flowing into the island in order to restore electricity, make sure you have safe drinking water, to take care of medical needs. And I don't want the fact that we're talking mostly about structural policy issues doesn't mean that I think that these assistance issues are second order or that they're not so important. I mean, they need to be continued and redoubled. At the same time, though, unless reconstruction efforts are accompanied by further reaching reforms, the reality is that congressional reconstruction assistance for Puerto Rico, however generous and however well executed it may be, will do little more than to restore the pre-hurricane status quo. And that pre-hurricane status quo was a government in bankruptcy, an economy in free fall, and a population looking for the exit by the thousand. Amidst the photos of roofless homes and trees stripped of their branches, it's easy to forget why Puerto Rico was in the headlines prior to Hurricane Maria. In 2016, the Commonwealth government ceased servicing its debt. In response, Congress passed, and President Obama appointed the board, the permissive board on which I served, to oversee what is the largest municipal bankruptcy in U.S. history, and I think it's one of the top 5 of any bankruptcy in world history. Puerto Rico's economy has shrunk nearly continuously since 2006, and its population has declined as residents have sought a better opportunity in the mainland U.S. In my view, the proximate causes of Puerto Rico's economic decline were the phase out of the federal corporate tax provision called Section 936, which gave businesses incentives to locate on the island, in conjunction with the wider economic recession that occurred in the wake of the housing price meltdown that affected the whole U.S. But the Section 936 phase out and recession were so devastating to Puerto Rico precisely because the island's core economic infrastructure was already so weak. And we see the same thing today in the wake of Hurricane Maria. Yes, the hurricane was truly devastating, one of the strongest ever to hit the United States. But adding to that destruction is that unlike Texas or Florida, which were also recently hit by hurricanes, Puerto Rico lacks the economic strength to recover on its own. And that lack of economic strength is rooted in poor policies and poor governance. At every corner, Puerto Ricans who wish to build a better life for their families are hamstrung by government programs and policies that undermine their success. For instance, while Puerto Rico's formal educational attainment is reasonably high, its educational quality is often abysmal. America's poorest performing mainland state, which is Alabama, had 26% of 8th graders deemed proficient or advanced in the National Assessment of Educational Progress. The 26%. Puerto Rico had 0%. Only 10% of Puerto Rico public school students scored at even the basic level, while 89% fell into the lowest category, below basic. I wouldn't even want to, if Puerto Rico fares that poorly relative to the worst mainland state, I wouldn't even want to see how they compare to Singapore, which has one of the best educational systems in the world. Compared to mainland schools, Puerto Rico schools devote a far greater share of their staffing to administration than to teachers. Ann mentioned that there are large numbers, a high teacher-to-student ratio in Puerto Rico, but many of the people you think are teaching are actually working in administration and not in the classroom. And among teachers who are in the classroom, absenteeism is rampant. A 2003 study found that average public school teacher missed 5 weeks of class time per year, an absentee amount that is matched by the students themselves. Back in 2011, Education Secretary Arne Duncan stated, "For years, Puerto Rico's education system has been plagued by revolving door leaders and political patronage. The education department must be depoliticized." Unfortunately, as Duncan pointed out, then elections won't fix these problems, and they haven't fixed them. So Puerto Rico students are poorly prepared for the workplace, but the workplace is even more poorly prepared for them. As Ann mentioned, Puerto Rico's labor force participation rate, which is around 38%, has for years lagged nearly 10 percentage points below the lowest U.S. state and 20 percentage points below the U.S. average. Puerto Rico's GNP would grow by roughly 10%, and many of its budget problems would be resolved if it raised its labor force participation rate to even that of the worst U.S. state. In other words, Puerto Rico doesn't have to become the best performing state in order to lessen its budget crisis. It merely needs to be the worst, but by a smaller margin. It's not, however, that Puerto Ricans can't work or won't work. They do, when they move to Orlando or New York or elsewhere on the mainland. But on the island, many forces keep Puerto Ricans out of work, even before the hurricane and before the current financial crisis. To start, Puerto Rico is an extensive welfare state which punishes work. About 40% of Puerto Ricans receive government assistance, which is even more essential in the wake of Hurricane Maria. The welfare rules impose punishing implicit tax rates on beneficiaries who choose to work. A 2008 study published by our neighbors over at Brookings found that for a variety of different household categories with different wage levels, working in the minimum wage or even twice the minimum wage failed to increase the household's take-home income, as welfare benefits were reduced dollar for dollar as earned income increased. As a result of these anti-work incentives, a 2005 survey found that the reservation wage among Puerto Rican men, the reservation wage is the minimum pay at which they were willing to take work, was about 1/3 higher than the minimum wage paid at the time. And the minimum wage in Puerto Rico is already far higher relative to median wages than in any mainland state. Puerto Rico is going to need large numbers of workers to help rebuild the island as it recovers from Hurricane Maria. Many of those jobs will require a willingness to work more than having specific technical skills. But Puerto Rico may have a hard time finding those workers among the island's roughly 900,000 non-working adults because the island's welfare formulas mean that families work, for many families, work often doesn't pay. But even when Puerto Ricans are willing to buck the welfare system and search for jobs, Puerto Rico's labor laws discourage businesses from hiring. This starts with mandatory benefits that far surpass the typical mainland state. Under Puerto Rico law, an employer is required to provide experienced full-time employees with at least 15 days of paid vacation, 12 sick days, and 9 public holidays. In addition, employers with more than 16 employees must pay a Christmas bonus equal to 3 weeks' salary. This is the 13th month check that Ann referred to. 8 weeks of paid maternity leave are mandated. Overtime must be paid for any work day longer than 8 hours, as in most states, not for a week in excess of 40 hours, as Ann noted.